Chapter 1: The Man in the Dust. Boston in early autumn had a way of making even expensive cars look dull under the gray sky. John Lee's did not deserve it. The black sedan rolled to a miserable halt beside a half-finished brick building, the engine coughing once before dying completely. For a few seconds John just sat there in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead. "You have got to be kidding me." His voice sounded flat in the quiet car. John Lee did not deal with broken cars. He dealt with concert halls, orchestras, Steinway grands, and crowds that stood when he finished playing. Engines and roadside breakdowns were not part of the life he had built. But here he was, back in Boston for the first time in months to visit his parents, and somehow the universe had decided this was how his morning would begin. He tried the ignition again. The engine made a grinding noise and gave up. John exhaled slowly and leaned his head back against the seat. Perfect. Outside the windshield he noticed movement. A construction site stood beside the road, scaffolding climbing the unfinished building. Workers moved across the area carrying materials, the air full of the steady rhythm of hammering and the scrape of bricks being set. Concrete dust drifted lazily through the air. John hesitated. He didn't love asking strangers for help. Fame made normal interactions complicated. But the car wasn't going anywhere, and the nearest repair shop was several blocks away. Finally he stepped out. The autumn air was cooler than he expected. The smell of cement and cut stone hit him immediately. Several workers glanced toward him as he approached the edge of the site. "Hey!" John called. Two men near a stack of tools looked up. One of them, shorter, wearing a red flannel under his vest, walked over. "You need something?" "My car died," John said, gesturing toward the sedan. "Would you mind taking a quick look? I just need to know if it's something obvious." The man shrugged. "Sure." Carlos grabbed the wrench. The second worker joined them, wiping his hands on a rag. Neither of them seemed to recognize John, which was a quiet relief. They followed him over to the car and popped the hood. The two men leaned in immediately, beginning a low conversation about battery connections and belts. John stepped back, giving them room. That was when he noticed him. Across the site, near a partially built brick wall, a very tall man worked alone. He was enormous, at least 6'5", maybe taller, broad shoulders stretching a faded gray work shirt. A thick dark beard framed his jaw, and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. He moved with quiet efficiency, lifting bricks, spreading mortar, setting each piece with precise taps of a trowel. Dust clung to his boots. Something about him felt steady, grounded. John found himself watching longer than he meant to. The tall worker didn't look up at first. Then, as if sensing the attention, he paused. Slowly he straightened and turned. Their eyes met across the construction site. The moment stretched unexpectedly long. John felt something strange then, a faint scent drifting through the dusty air. Apples. He frowned slightly. Someone nearby must have been eating fruit. The tall man continued staring, dark eyes curious but calm. Not hostile, just aware. Then one of the workers under John's hood spoke. "Yeah, your battery cable's loose." John blinked, breaking the moment. "What?" Carlos pointed. "Probably rattled loose. We can tighten it for you. Please." They worked quickly, tightening the connection and checking a few other things. Within minutes, the first worker shut the hood. "Try it now." John slid back into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine started immediately. Relief washed through him. He stepped out again. "Thank you." Seriously. The men waved it off. Not a big deal. John glanced once more toward the brick wall. The tall worker had returned to his task, setting another brick. Careful, precise. For some reason John lingered for a second longer than necessary before getting into the car. As he drove away, he caught one last glimpse of the man in the rearview mirror. And strangely, he felt like he had forgotten something. Chapter 2: The Man at the Piano. By the time the workday ended, Mark Samuel's shoulders ached in the satisfying way they always did after a full shift. Brickwork was repetitive but honest. Lift, spread mortar, place, tap, align. again and again until the wall slowly rose from nothing. 25 years in construction had given him arms like steel cables and a patience most people didn't have. Still, even patience ran out eventually. "Beer," Carlos declared, tossing his gloves into the back of his truck. "I need beer." Mark chuckled, wiping mortar dust from his beard with the back of his hand. "You say that every day, because every day is a beer day." Luis snorted from the passenger side. "You're just looking for excuses." "Excuses are important." Mark climbed into the back seat of Carlos's old pickup, stretching his long legs awkwardly into the cramped space. The bar they visited after work wasn't fancy. It never had been. It was a small neighborhood place 2 blocks from the site where construction crews, electricians, and plumbers gathered after long shifts. The lighting was dim, the floor slightly sticky, and the beer always cold. Exactly the way they liked it. They settled into their usual booth. Carlos ordered a round before anyone could ask. Mark leaned back, rolling tension out of his neck. The quiet hum of conversation filled the bar, punctuated by occasional laughter and the soft clink of glasses. For a while, the 3 of them talked about work. A crooked foundation on another site. The new foreman nobody liked. Luis complaining about his landlord again. Normal things. Mark barely noticed the television mounted above the bar at first. It was playing some classical music channel, something the bartender liked. Soft piano music drifted through the speakers. Luis glanced up at it. "Man," he said, squinting. "You ever listen to this stuff?" Carlos shook his head immediately. "I fall asleep." Mark lifted his eyes lazily toward the screen. The moment he saw the pianist, he froze. The man sat behind a black grand piano on a massive concert stage. Spotlights bathed him in warm gold light as his fingers moved across the keys with impossible precision. Even in formal black attire, Mark recognized him instantly. Same sharp jaw, same focused eyes, same calm, serious expression. The guy from the broken car. Mark blinked slowly. "Wait." Carlos looked at him. "What?" Mark pointed at the television. "That guy." Luis squinted. "Yeah. I saw him today." Carlos laughed. "You saw a pianist today?" "No," Mark said slowly. "I saw him with a broken car." Both men turned to the screen again. The television displayed a title beneath the stage. "John Lee live in Vienna." Luis whistled quietly. "Hold up," he said. "That guy's famous." Carlos grabbed his phone immediately and typed something. 2 seconds later his eyebrows shot up. "Oh hell. What?" Mark asked. Carlos turned the phone toward him. On the screen was the same man, dressed sharply in a tuxedo beside a massive piano. John Lee, world-renowned pianist. Millionaire, Carlos added. Tours everywhere. New York, Paris, Tokyo. Mark leaned back slowly. The construction site flashed through his memory. The quiet man standing beside the car. The moment their eyes met across the dust. "That's him," Mark said. Luis laughed. "You mean a world-famous pianist pulled over next to our busted construction site?" "Guess so." Carlos shook his head. "Did you talk to him?" "Not really. You should have asked for tickets." Mark chuckled softly, though his attention had drifted back to the television. John Lee's hands moved across the piano keys like flowing water. Precise, controlled, beautiful. The crowd on the screen sat in absolute silence, hanging on every note. Mark felt something strange twist in his chest. That same quiet pull he'd felt earlier when their eyes met. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Funny thing," Mark muttered. "What?" Carlos asked. Mark shrugged. For a rich guy, he didn't act like one. Luis raised an eyebrow. "Maybe he's just good at pretending." Maybe. But Mark wasn't sure. He leaned forward slightly, watching the performance. The pianist's expression remained serious, almost distant. But the music was full of something deeper. Something emotional. Lonely, maybe. Mark took a sip of his beer. A faint scent drifted through his senses again. Leather. Concrete. Strange combination. He frowned slightly. Alphas had stronger pheromones than omegas most of the time. But that scent felt controlled, disciplined, like the man himself. Mark leaned back again, shaking his head at himself. Doesn't matter, he murmured. Carlos looked over. What doesn't? Mark waved it off. Nothing. Still, when the performance ended on the screen and the crowd erupted into applause, Mark found himself smiling. Chapter 3 Second Encounter. The morning started like any other. Cold air, brick dust, the steady rhythm of work. Mark Samuel stood on the scaffold again, mortar spread carefully across the growing wall in front of him. His movements were automatic after decades of practice. Smooth, efficient, practiced enough that he could carry on full conversations without missing a line. Today, though, he was quieter than usual. Carlos noticed it immediately. You thinking about the piano guy again? He asked from below. Mark snorted softly. No. Luis laughed. That means yes. Mark ignored them and placed another brick. Tap, tap, perfect alignment. Still, his eyes drifted toward the road every so often without him realizing it. He wasn't expecting anything. People with cars like that didn't come back to construction sites. They certainly didn't come back for construction workers. So when the familiar black sedan rolled slowly toward the curb again, Mark froze. Carlos noticed first. Hey, he said, nudging Luis. Look who's back. The car parked near the same spot as yesterday. The driver's door opened, and out stepped John Lee, even dressed casually. Dark jeans, black jacket. He looked strangely out of place against the dusty construction backdrop. Too clean, too composed. But he also looked hesitant. Mark watched him walk toward the site. John carried something in his hand. A wrench. Carlos grinned. Guess he liked our service. Luis called out as John approached. Car break down again? John shook his head quickly. No, it's fine. He lifted the wrench slightly. I realized I forgot to return this yesterday. Carlos laughed. You drove back just for that? John shrugged. I borrowed it. Mark climbed down from the scaffold before he even realized he'd decided to. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. Up close, John looked exactly the same as yesterday, serious expression, sharp features, eyes that seemed to analyze everything around him. But there was something else now. Recognition. John's gaze landed on him immediately. For a brief second, neither spoke. Then Mark stepped forward and held out his hand. Mark. His voice was warm, steady. Mark Samuel. John blinked once, almost like he'd been pulled out of deep thought. Then he took the offered hand. John, he said. A pause. John Lee. Their handshake should have lasted a second. Instead it stretched just a little longer. Mark's grip was firm, calloused from years of work. John's was surprisingly strong for someone who played piano for a living. And the pheromones hit them both at once. Concrete and leather. Steady. Grounded. Controlled. Mark felt it settle around him like the weight of a solid foundation. John noticed the faint sweetness in return. Apples. Not strong, but unmistakable. Neither mentioned it. Carlos cleared his throat dramatically behind them. So, he said, world-famous pianist, huh? John stiffened slightly. Mark shot Carlos a look. John sighed. You saw that. Luis grinned. Bar TV. For a moment John looked like he expected things to get awkward. Instead Mark just shrugged. Pretty impressive. The simplicity of the reaction clearly surprised him. You don't care? John asked. Mark leaned casually against a stack of bricks. I lay bricks, he said. You play piano. John blinked. That's it. Mark smiled. That's it. Something in John's shoulders relaxed. They talked for a few minutes after that. John mentioned he was visiting his parents for a few weeks. Mark mentioned he'd worked construction since he was 20. The conversation felt oddly easy. Eventually John glanced at his watch. I should go. He hesitated slightly, then said, almost casually, Do you know any good coffee places around here? Mark tilted his head. Yeah. There's a place 2 blocks down. Corner Cafe. Nothing fancy. John nodded thoughtfully. Sounds good. Carlos smirked behind them. Mark ignored him. John took a step back toward his car. "Thanks again for yesterday," he said. Mark waved it off. "No problem." John got into the car. But before he closed the door, he glanced back one more time. Mark was still watching. For some reason, that made John smile faintly. Then he drove away. Carlos immediately turned toward Mark. "You realize that was flirting, right?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "With coffee?" Luis laughed. "Man literally drove back to return a wrench." Mark rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Maybe he's just polite." Carlos shook his head. "You are hopeless." Mark looked back at the road where the sedan had disappeared. Hopeless. Maybe. But the faint scent of leather still lingered in the air. And he had a strange feeling that wouldn't be the last time he saw John Lee. Chapter 4: Coffee that wasn't a date. John Lee told himself he was only getting coffee. Nothing more. The small cafe sat exactly where Mark had said it would be, on the corner 2 blocks from the construction site. The windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and a wooden sign above the door read "Corner Cup" in faded paint. It looked comfortable. Normal. John stepped inside. The smell of roasted beans and baked pastries replaced the cool autumn air. A few customers sat scattered around the cafe, most of them typing on laptops or quietly talking over mugs. No one paid him any attention. That alone made the place worth coming back to. He ordered a black coffee and moved toward a small table by the window. For the first few minutes, everything was peaceful. John sipped slowly, staring outside at pedestrians passing by. His mind drifted lazily through upcoming concerts, unfinished emails, and the quiet relief of being back in Boston for a short time. Then the door opened. A tall figure stepped inside. Construction boots, gray work shirt, dark beard dusted faintly with mortar. Mark Samuel. John blinked. Mark looked just as surprised. For a moment they simply stared at each other across the cafe. Then Mark laughed softly. "Well," he said, walking over, "guess the coffee's good if you came back." John felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward before he could stop it. "You recommended it." Mark gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Mind?" John shook his head. "Go ahead." Mark ordered his coffee at the counter before joining him at the table. Up close again, the subtle scent of apples lingered faintly around him, warm and easy. John noticed it immediately. He also noticed how large Mark looked sitting in a regular cafe chair. The table suddenly felt small. Mark wrapped his hands around his mug when it arrived. "So," he said casually, "you're a pianist." John exhaled lightly. "Word travels fast." "Bar television," Mark said with a shrug. John studied him carefully. "You didn't say anything yesterday. Didn't seem important." That answer surprised him again. Most people reacted to fame one of 2 ways, either excited or awkward. Mark seemed completely unaffected. "What were you doing in Vienna?" Mark asked. "Performing." Mark nodded slowly. Looked intense. John raised an eyebrow. "You watched?" "Little bit." Mark smiled slightly into his coffee. "You play like someone's chasing you." John stared at him. No interviewer had ever described his music like that before. "That's a strange way to put it." Mark shrugged. "Just what it looked like." They talked longer than either expected. About Boston. About Mark's years in construction. About how John had grown up nearby before traveling the world for concerts. At one point Mark leaned back in his chair and studied him. "You grew up middle class?" he asked. John nodded. "Yeah." Mark seemed to relax slightly at that. "Good," he said. John blinked. "Good. Means you know how normal people live." John almost laughed. Before he realized it, nearly 40 minutes had passed. Mark eventually glanced at his phone. "Break's almost over," he said. He stood up reluctantly. John felt an odd flicker of disappointment. Then Mark hesitated. "You know," he said casually, "if you're in Boston a while, there's a lot better food around here than diner coffee." John looked up. "Are you inviting me somewhere?" Mark chuckled. "I might be." The words hung between them. John reached for his phone. "Do you text?" Mark's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sometimes." They both pulled out their phones. Mark dictated his number slowly while John entered it. Then John showed his screen. Did I get it right? Mark nodded. Yeah. John saved the contact. Mark Brick Guy. Mark typed quickly into his own phone. Then he held it up. John Piano. John stared at the name and finally laughed. A quiet, genuine sound. That's terrible. Accurate, Mark replied. They walked toward the door together. Outside, the cool air greeted them again. Mark headed toward the construction site. John toward his parked car. They paused briefly on the sidewalk. See you around, Mark said. Yeah, John replied. Their phones remained silent the rest of the day. But that night, both men found themselves staring at the newly saved contact. Waiting. Chapter 5, Apples and Concrete. John stared at his phone. It had been sitting on the table in front of him for nearly 20 minutes. The contact was still open. Mark Brick Guy. He exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple. This was ridiculous. He had performed in front of thousands of people without feeling nervous. He had walked onto the stages of the largest concert halls in the world and played flawlessly under blinding lights. But texting a construction worker apparently required emotional preparation. John leaned back in the chair at his parents' dining table, staring at the screen again. Just send something. Anything. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed, "Did the wall survive today?" He stared at the message for 5 seconds. Then pressed send. The moment it disappeared, he set the phone down like it might explode. A minute passed. Then another. John picked it up again. Still nothing. He told himself that was fine. Mark had probably gone to sleep early. Construction workers woke up before sunrise. He set the phone down again. It buzzed immediately. John grabbed it so quickly he nearly dropped it. A message appeared. Mark Brick Guy. Barely. A second message arrived right after. A photo. John opened it. The picture showed a section of freshly completed brick wall glowing under a construction floodlight. The lines were straight and clean, the mortar smooth and even. Even someone who knew nothing about construction could tell the work was precise. John typed back, "That looks solid." 3 dots appeared instantly. Mark Brick Guy. Better be. Took me half the day. John hesitated, then asked, "You build the whole thing yourself?" The reply came a moment later. "Mostly. Carlos complains too much." John smiled slightly. The conversation continued. Slowly at first, then more easily. They talked about simple things. Mark asked what John had been doing that evening. "Practicing," John replied. "Of course you were," Mark sent back. John asked how long Mark had been working construction. "Since I was 20, came the reply. 25 years now. John paused at that. He typed, "You must really like it." Mark took longer to answer that one. Finally a message appeared. "I like building things that stay standing." John read the line twice. Something about it felt very Mark. His phone buzzed again. Mark Brick Guy. Plus I'm too old to start over now. John frowned slightly at that. 45 isn't that old. The reply came quickly. "Depends what you're talking about." John leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "What do you mean?" There was a pause. Then another message appeared. "You believe in fated pairs?" John blinked. That wasn't where he expected the conversation to go. In the Alpha-Omega world, the concept existed everywhere. The idea that somewhere out there, every Alpha and Omega had one perfect match. Most people believed in it. Others treated it like a romantic myth. John typed carefully, "I'm not against the idea." He added another line, "But I don't rely on it." The typing bubble appeared again. Mark Brick Guy. Yeah. Same. Another message followed. "Except I used to believe in it more." John waited. Then the next message appeared. "Just seems unlikely now." John stared at the screen. "Because of your age?" The response came after a long pause. Yeah. Then another. 45-year-old Omega bricklayers don't exactly get swept off their feet by destiny. John leaned back in his chair slowly. He wasn't sure why that statement bothered him. Maybe it was the quiet way Mark had said it. Like he'd already accepted the idea. John looked down at his phone again. I don't think fate cares about timing. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, then returned. Finally Mark sent. That sounds like something a pianist would say. John huffed a quiet laugh. They kept texting. About music. About Boston neighborhoods. About the ridiculous names they'd saved in their phones. Eventually the clock crept past midnight. Mark sent one last message. I should sleep. 5 a.m. comes fast. John typed back. Good night, Mark. A pause. Then, night, John. The conversation ended. John placed the phone down beside him. But the faint scent he remembered from earlier seemed to linger in his thoughts. Apples. Strangely warm. Chapter 6, The Concert Hall. Mark had turned the invitation down twice. The first time was immediate. I probably fall asleep. The second time was slower. Not really my scene. John Lee was persistent in a quiet way. He didn't push. He didn't argue. He just sent another message the following evening. It's only a rehearsal. No audience. Mark had stared at the phone for a long time. Then he typed back. You're not giving up, are you? John's reply came quickly. No. Mark rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Finally he sighed and sent. Fine. But if I snore, that's your fault. The concert hall was enormous. Mark stood in the lobby looking around with mild disbelief. The ceilings were high enough to swallow echoes, and polished marble floors reflected the warm golden lights overhead. People moved quietly through the space carrying sheet music and instrument cases. Everyone looked refined. Mark suddenly became very aware of his work boots. He changed into clean jeans and a dark button-up shirt, but standing here still made him feel like a misplaced truck in a luxury parking garage. A young staff member approached him. Can I help you? Mark said, scratching the back of his neck. I'm here for rehearsal. Name? Mark Samuel. The woman checked a list and smiled. Mr. Lee is expecting you. Mark blinked. Mr. Lee, right? She guided him through a side hallway toward the stage entrance. The closer they got, the clearer the music became. Soft at first, then stronger. Piano. Mark paused just inside the stage doorway. John sat alone under the overhead lights at a massive black grand piano. The stage was empty except for him. His back was straight, shoulders relaxed but focused, fingers gliding across the keys with calm precision. The sound filled the entire hall. Even during rehearsal, the music carried an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Mark leaned quietly against the wall, watching. Yesterday John had been texting jokes about construction boots. Now he looked completely different, controlled, powerful, like someone who had spent years mastering something most people could never touch. The music built slowly, notes layering over each other like careful brickwork. Mark realized something after a minute. John really did play like someone was chasing him. Every movement had urgency beneath the calm surface. The piece ended abruptly. John's hands hovered over the keys for a second. Then he exhaled and leaned back slightly. Thought you might fall asleep. Mark's head snapped up. John had turned on the bench and was looking directly at him. Mark laughed under his breath. You knew I was here? Your boots, John said simply. Mark walked slowly onto the stage. Up close, the piano looked enormous. You practice like that all the time? He asked. Mostly. Mark shook his head slightly. That's intense. John watched him carefully. Too much. Mark met his gaze. No. He hesitated. Actually kind of amazing. John blinked once. That answer seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet stage lights cast warm shadows across the polished piano. Mark leaned casually against the edge of the instrument. You always look that serious when you play? Yes. Mark tilted his head. Why? John considered the question. Because it matters. Mark studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I get that. Something about the way Mark said it made John's shoulders relax. They talked for another 20 minutes while the orchestra members slowly began arriving. Musicians filtered onto the stage, tuning instruments and greeting John casually. Several of them glanced curiously at Mark but didn't say anything. Eventually John stood. I have to start soon. Mark nodded. Yeah. He took a step toward the exit, then paused. You're good, you know? John raised an eyebrow. That's what they keep telling me. Mark grinned slightly. Yeah. But I mean it. For the first time since leaving the piano bench, John smiled. Not the polite expression people saw in interviews. A real one. Mark felt something strange flip in his stomach. Then he quickly cleared his throat. I'll get out of your way. As he walked toward the door, John watched him go. The faint scent of apples lingered in the air long after Mark left the stage. Chapter 7: The Late Night Diner. The message came about an hour after rehearsal ended. John had just returned to his apartment and loosened the collar of his shirt when his phone buzzed. Mark, brick guy, you still alive after all that piano violence? John huffed a quiet laugh. Barely. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Good. Then another message. Because I think you owe me food. John frowned slightly at the screen. I owe you? The reply came instantly. You dragged a construction worker into a concert hall. That requires compensation. John stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed, what kind of compensation? The answer arrived. A diner. John blinked. A diner? Best one in the neighborhood. John leaned back in his chair, considering. He had eaten in Michelin-star restaurants across Europe. Elegant dining rooms with candlelight and quiet violin quartets. But something about the idea made him curious. Where? The address appeared seconds later. Open all night. Meet me there. The diner was exactly what Mark promised. Small, bright, and very, very ordinary. Neon lights hummed softly above the windows, and the smell of grilled burgers floated through the air when John stepped inside. Mark was already there, sitting in a booth near the back. He looked relaxed, one arm stretched across the seat behind him. When he spotted John, he grinned. Well, look at that, Mark said. Fancy pianist actually showed up. John slid into the booth across from him. You invited me. Didn't think you'd come. A waitress appeared before John could respond. Mark ordered immediately. 2 burgers, fries, coffee. She nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. John raised an eyebrow. You didn't ask what I wanted. Mark leaned back comfortably. Trust me. John folded his arms. That's dangerous. Mark chuckled. For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence. The diner was busy with late-night customers, truck drivers, college students, night shift workers. No one paid them any attention. Felt strangely peaceful. Finally Mark spoke. So how rich are you? John blinked. That's a direct question. Mark shrugged. You're a world-famous pianist. That doesn't automatically mean. Mark lifted an eyebrow. John sighed. Comfortable. Mark grinned. That's what rich people say. The burgers arrived then, cutting off the conversation. Mark picked his up immediately. Eat, he said. John hesitated for half a second before taking a bite, then paused. Okay. Mark smirked. Told you. They ate for a while. Conversation drifted to childhood. Mark grew up in Boston too, though in a different neighborhood. Construction had been his life since his early 20s. John talked about studying piano for hours every day growing up. The discipline, the competitions, the endless practice. At one point Mark leaned forward slightly. You ever wish you'd done something normal? John considered the question. No. Mark nodded slowly. Good. John tilted his head. Why? Mark shrugged. Because you'd probably be miserable laying bricks. John studied him for a moment. And you? What about me? Do you ever wish you'd done something else? Mark leaned back again. Nah. He took another bite of his burger. I like building things that stay. The answer felt familiar. John smiled faintly. Eventually the conversation slowed. Mark tapped his fingers against his coffee mug. You know, there's something weird about this. John raised an eyebrow. What? Mark gestured between them. You. Then pointed to himself. Me. John waited. Mark sighed softly. You're 30. World famous. Millionaire pianist. John's expression tightened slightly. And? Mark shrugged. I'm 45. John frowned. That's not exactly ancient. Mark chuckled. It's 15 years older than you. The words hung in the air for a moment. John didn't respond immediately. Mark noticed, and that silence told him enough. He leaned back slightly, shoulders tightening just a little. The warmth that had filled the booth earlier shifted subtly. Not gone, just cautious. John finally spoke. I don't think that matters. Mark gave a small smile. Maybe not to you. He lifted his coffee cup again. But something in his expression had changed. And John noticed it. Chapter 8 headlines. The first message arrived early in the morning. John was halfway through a quiet breakfast at his parents' house when his phone buzzed repeatedly on the table. He glanced down. 5 notifications. Then 8. Then 12. His manager's name appeared on the screen. John sighed and answered the call. Morning, Daniel. John, Daniel said immediately. Why are you trending? John paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth. What? Daniel made a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and amusement. You've been spotted around Boston all week. Fans are posting pictures. John leaned back in his chair. That happens everywhere. Yes, Daniel replied patiently. But this time you're not alone. John frowned. What does that mean? Someone photographed you in a diner 2 nights ago. John froze. The image of the small booth flashed through his mind. Mark leaning back casually, laughing at something John had said. Daniel continued. The internet wants to know who the giant bearded man is. John rubbed his temple. Fantastic. It's not a scandal, Daniel added quickly. Just speculation. Some people think he's security. Others think he's a friend. John stared at the kitchen wall. Friend. That sounded strangely complicated. I'm not worried about it, John said. Good, Daniel replied. Because it'll pass in a few days. They ended the call soon after. John opened his social media out of curiosity. It didn't take long to find the photo. The image was grainy, clearly taken through the diner window, but it was unmistakable. John sat on one side of the booth. Across from him, Mark Samuel looked enormous even while seated, beard catching the bright diner lights. The caption read, John Lee spotted in Boston with Mystery Man? John stared at the photo for a moment. Then he closed the app. He wasn't worried about the attention. He had dealt with far worse. Still, his phone was already in his hand when he opened Mark's contact. Mark Brick Guy. He typed a message. Have you checked the internet today? The message delivered. John waited. Nothing. He frowned slightly. Mark usually responded quickly during morning breaks. 10 minutes passed. Still nothing. Mark saw the photo during lunch. Carlos was the one who showed him. Hey, Carlos said, sliding his phone across the table. You're famous now. Mark glanced down casually, then froze. The image showed him sitting in the diner booth across from John. His beard, his shoulders, impossible to miss. Mark stared at it for several seconds. Luis leaned over his shoulder. Whoa! Carlos scrolled through the comments. People think you're a bodyguard. Luis laughed loudly. Bodyguard? That's perfect. Mark didn't laugh. He leaned back slowly in his chair. How many people saw this? Carlos shrugged. Internet's big. Luis added. Honestly, you look intimidating enough. Mark rubbed his beard, staring at the phone again. The comments kept scrolling. Who is he? Security? Boyfriend? Is John Lee dating a lumberjack? Mark exhaled slowly. That strange tight feeling from the diner returned to his chest. Except now it was stronger. This was John's world. Tension. Speculation. Millions of strangers staring at blurry photos. Mark had spent his entire life avoiding attention. Now it was looking straight at him. His own phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from John. Have you checked the internet today? Mark read it once. Then again. He typed a response. Stopped. Deleted it. Then locked the screen. Carlos noticed immediately. You gonna answer him? Mark shook his head. Later. But later never came. John checked his phone again that evening. Still no reply. That was unusual. He sent another message. Everything okay? No answer. The next day passed the same way. Then the second day. Nothing. By the third morning, John had run out of patience. He drove straight to the construction site. The familiar sound of tools echoed through the half-built structure. Workers moved across the scaffolding. And near the brick wall, Mark Samuel stood exactly where John expected him to be, laying bricks like nothing had changed. John stepped onto the site. Mark. The tall Omega paused. Slowly he turned around. Their eyes met. For the first time since they met, Mark didn't smile. Chapter 9, Fault Lines. John didn't wait to be invited further in. The moment Mark turned back toward the wall, he stepped onto the construction site, boots crunching against gravel. Mark. The name landed sharper this time. Mark set the brick down more firmly than necessary before turning around again. Up close, the difference was obvious. He looked tired. Not physically. Mark was always strong, steady. But something behind his eyes had shifted. John, Mark said. His tone was neutral. Too neutral. John stopped a few feet away. You ignored my messages. Mark exhaled slowly through his nose. Yeah. That's it. John asked. Just, yeah? Mark glanced toward Carlos and Luis, who had suddenly become very interested in tools across the site. Not here, Mark muttered. He stepped away from the wall, heading toward the quieter side of the building. John followed. They stopped near a stack of lumber, partially shielded from the rest of the crew. For a moment, neither spoke. Then John broke first. What happened? Mark rubbed a hand over his beard. You saw the photo. John frowned. That's what this is about? Mark let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Easy for you to say. John crossed his arms. Then explain it to me. Mark turned toward him fully now. That's your life, John, he said, gesturing vaguely outward. People taking pictures, guessing things, talking about you like you're public property. And, John pressed, and I'm not part of that world. The words were simple, but they carried weight. John stepped closer. You were just having dinner with me. Exactly, Mark said. John blinked. That's a problem? Mark shook his head. No, it's everything that comes with it. He pulled his phone out and unlocked it, bringing up the same photo Carlos had shown him earlier. He held it out. Look at that. John barely glanced at the image. I already have. Then you know what people are saying. I don't care what people are saying, John replied flatly. Mark's jaw tightened. Yeah, he said quietly. That's the difference. The words landed harder than anything else. John stared at him. What's that supposed to mean? Mark lowered the phone. It means you can ignore it because you're used to it. He took a breath. I've spent my whole life staying out of the spotlight. John's voice sharpened. I didn't ask you to be in the spotlight. Mark laughed under his breath. You didn't have to. The air between them shifted. Thicker now. Heavier. John stepped even closer. Then what do you want me to do? Stop seeing you? Mark didn't answer. That silence said enough. John's expression hardened slightly. Say it. Mark met his eyes. You deserve someone who fits into your life. John let out a sharp breath. We've been over this. Have we? Mark shot back. You're 30. You travel the world. You play in front of thousands of people. He gestured toward himself. I'm 45, John. I lay bricks. John's voice dropped. I know exactly what you do. Then you know this doesn't make sense. It makes sense to me. Mark shook his head. Not long term. The words hit harder than anything else. John went still. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the shift happened. Subtle at first. Then undeniable. Their pheromones spiked. The scent of apples thickened in the air. No longer faint but warm and insistent. In response, John's scent sharpened. Concrete and leather. Grounding but suddenly more intense. Mark inhaled sharply. Don't. John didn't step back. Don't what? Mark clenched his jaw. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything, John said. though his voice had dropped lower. The pull between them tightened. Instinct. Biology. Something neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. Mark forced himself to take a step back. "See," he said quietly. "This is exactly what I mean." John frowned. "What?" Mark gestured between them. "This, whatever this is, it's not simple." John's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't think it was." Mark shook his head again. "You should." The words came out softer this time. "Tired." John stared at him for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "You're the only person who doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass." Mark's expression flickered. "That's not a good reason to stay." "It is for me." Silence settled again. The tension didn't disappear. If anything, it deepened. But something in Mark's posture shifted. Not completely closed off. Just guarded. Finally, he looked away. "I need to get back to work." John didn't move immediately. Then he nodded once. "Right?" He turned and walked back toward the edge of the site. Mark stayed where he was for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to ignore the lingering scent of leather in the air, trying to ignore the way his chest felt tight. Neither of them looked back. Chapter 10: What Fate Feels Like. The argument from 2 days earlier still echoed in John's head. It had ended abruptly. Mark insisting the attention surrounding John's life was too big, too public. John insisting Mark was the only person who treated him like something other than a famous name. Neither of them had won. They had simply walked away. Now Boston felt different. John buried himself in practice at the concert hall, playing harder than usual, the music sharper and more restless. Even the orchestra noticed the change. "You're pushing the tempo," the conductor said during rehearsal. John didn't respond. He simply started the piece again. But concentration wasn't working the way it normally did. Because every time the music paused, he thought about a tall construction worker who smelled faintly like apples. Across the city, Mark Samuel tried to focus on work. It wasn't going well. The bricks in front of him blurred slightly as he spread mortar along the row. Tap, tap, set. He'd done this motion thousands of times. But today something felt off. His skin felt too warm. The air felt thicker. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Carlos noticed immediately. "You good?" he asked. Mark nodded automatically. "Yeah." But 10 minutes later, the trowel slipped slightly in his hand. Mark froze. A familiar heat was creeping through his body. It wasn't subtle. And it definitely wasn't scheduled. Omega heats usually gave warnings. Days of rising tension, irritability, scent changes. This one hit like a lightning strike. Mark inhaled sharply. "That's not good." Luis looked up from below the scaffold. "What?" Mark climbed down slowly. His legs felt heavier than usual. Carlos frowned. "Man, you look pale." Mark rubbed his face. "Heat." Both men blinked. "Now?" Luis asked. "Yeah." Carlos swore quietly. "That's rough timing." Mark nodded grimly. Omega heats could be manageable alone, but they were intense. And right now his body felt like it had decided to ignite without warning. He pulled his phone out. There was one number his mind immediately went to. John Piano. Mark stared at the name. His thumb hovered. Then he shook his head. No, that was a terrible idea. He'd already complicated John's life enough. Calling him during a heat would only make things worse. Mark shoved the phone back into his pocket. "I'm heading home," he muttered. Carlos nodded immediately. "Yeah, go." John finished rehearsal late that afternoon. His phone was in his coat pocket when he stepped outside the concert hall. He checked it absently. 2 missed calls. Both from the same contact. Mark Brick Guy. John stopped walking. The calls were only 10 minutes apart. And both had come an hour earlier. He immediately dialed back. The phone rang. Once. Twice. No answer. John tried again. Still nothing. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Mark never called. Texting was one thing. But calling? Something had to be wrong. John slid into his car without hesitation. The address he had memorized from earlier conversations guided him through the quiet Boston streets. By the time he reached Mark's apartment building, evening had settled over the city. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, then knocked. Once, twice. Inside the apartment, Mark Samuel sat on the edge of his couch. His shirt was damp with sweat. The heat had only grown stronger over the last hour. His senses felt sharpened and unfocused at the same time. And the scent filling the room was impossible to ignore. Concrete, leather, alpha pheromones lingering in his memory. Mark closed his eyes and breathed slowly. Control. He needed control. Then, a knock echoed through the door. Mark froze. Another knock followed. Mark! John's voice. Mark stared at the door like it had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Oh no! Chapter 11, Almost Goodbye. The knock came again. Mark! John's voice carried through the apartment door. Steady, but clearly concerned. Mark closed his eyes for a second. His entire body felt wrong. Heat burned through his skin. His senses sharpened to the point where every sound felt louder, every sense stronger. And right now the scent outside his door was unmistakable. Concrete, leather, John. Mark stood slowly, gripping the back of the couch for balance. Go away, he called toward the door. Silence followed. Then John spoke again. Mark, you called me. Mark winced. Right. He had. Twice. The memory made his face heat further. That was a mistake, Mark said hoarsely. Another pause. I'm not leaving, John replied. Mark swore under his breath. His instincts were already on edge, and the sound of John's voice this close to the door made it worse. Omega heat was cruel like that. It rewired parts of the brain, pushing instincts forward whether you liked it or not. Mark walked toward the door reluctantly and opened it a few inches. John stood in the hallway. The moment their eyes met, John's expression changed. Concern sharpened immediately. You're in heat. Mark leaned against the doorframe. Yeah. John's gaze swept over him quickly. Flushed skin, damp shirt, heavy breathing. The signs were obvious. You should have told me, John said quietly. Mark gave a tired laugh. Why? John hesitated. I could help. Mark's shoulders stiffened instantly. No. The answer came too fast. Too sharp. John stepped back slightly. I didn't mean. I know what you meant, Mark interrupted. The apartment hallway filled with the faint scent of apples. Stronger now than John had ever smelled before. It mixed with John's own pheromones in the small space, thickening the air. John forced himself to stay calm. Mark. Mark shook his head. You need to go. John didn't move. You called me. I shouldn't have. The words were quieter now. Mark rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion slipping into his voice. Look. This isn't something you should deal with. John frowned. Why not? Mark met his eyes. Because you're John Lee. John blinked. And? Mark gestured vaguely between them. You've got concerts, tours, millions of fans watching everything you do. He exhaled slowly. I'm a 45-year-old Omega bricklayer sitting here sweating through an unexpected heat. John's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean. It means you deserve someone who fits into your life, Mark said. The words were calm, but they carried weight. You deserve someone younger, he continued. Someone who won't show up in blurry diner photos and confuse the internet. John stared at him. That's not what I want. Mark looked away. Doesn't matter. The silence stretched between them. Finally John spoke again. Do you actually believe that? Mark didn't answer immediately. Then he shrugged. Seems realistic. The hallway smelled strongly of apples now. Mark's control was slipping slightly. He could feel it, and that terrified him. John, he said quietly. You really need to leave. John held his gaze for several seconds. Every instinct as an alpha told him to stay, to protect, to help, but Mark's expression was firm. Finally John nodded once. Okay. He stepped back toward the stairwell. Mark relaxed slightly when the distance increased. Before leaving, John looked at him again. If you need anything, I won't, Mark interrupted gently. John hesitated. Then he turned and walked down the stairs. Mark closed the door. The apartment fell silent again. He leaned against it, breathing slowly as the heat continued to burn through his system. On the other side of the building, John stepped outside into the cold Boston air. The scent of apples still lingered faintly in his memory. The next morning, John woke to a message. Mark, Brick Guy, I'm sorry about yesterday. John stared at the screen, then typed slowly. You don't need to apologize. The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared, then returned. Finally Mark sent. Still think it's better if we slow things down. John felt something sink slightly in his chest. Chapter 12. The Silence. The heat passed slowly. Mark Samuel had experienced plenty in his life, but the one that hit him 2 days ago had been unusually brutal. Unexpected. Unforgiving. By the time the worst of it faded, exhaustion clung to his muscles like wet cement. Still, life didn't stop because of biology. On Monday morning, Mark stood at the construction site again. Brick, mortar, trowel. The familiar rhythm returned piece by piece. Tap, tap, a line. Carlos glanced at him from across the scaffold. You look less like death today, he said. Mark huffed quietly. Good to know. Luis laughed from below. You scared the hell out of us, man. That heat hit like a truck. Felt like one, Mark admitted. He lifted another brick into place. For a while the work helped. Physical labor had always been good for clearing his mind. Except this time it didn't work as well as usual. Because every time his hands paused, his mind drifted back to the apartment door. John standing there in the hallway. The look in his eyes when Mark told him to leave. Mark pressed the brick down harder than necessary. Carlos noticed. You two fight or something? Mark didn't answer. Carlos sighed. Yeah, that's what I thought. Across the city, John packed a suitcase. His apartment looked half empty already. Clothes folded neatly. Sheet music stacked beside the door. The next tour schedule sat open on his phone. Chicago, London, Vienna again. It would be months before he came back to Boston. Normally that didn't bother him. Travel had been his life since he was 19. But this time something felt unfinished. John sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his phone. Mark, Brick Guy. Their last conversation was still sitting there. Still think it's better if we slow things down. John exhaled slowly. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe they had rushed into something that didn't make sense. Still, John typed a message. I'm leaving Boston in 2 days. He hesitated before adding another line. Thought you should know. Then he pressed send. Mark saw the message during lunch. He had just sat down on a stack of lumber when his phone buzzed. The words on the screen made his stomach drop. I'm leaving Boston in 2 days. Mark stared at it. 2 days? That wasn't something John had mentioned before. He felt strangely blindsided, like the ground had shifted without warning. Carlos leaned over. Everything okay? Mark locked his phone. Yeah. But the lie didn't sound convincing. The next evening, Mark walked into the cafe. The same one where they had exchanged numbers. Corner cup. John was already sitting by the window. When Mark stepped inside, their eyes met immediately. Neither smiled. Mark walked over slowly and sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The waitress brought coffee without asking. John finally broke the silence. I didn't expect you to come. Mark stared into his mug. You said you were leaving. John nodded. In 2 days. The quiet between them felt heavier than before. Outside, people passed along the sidewalk, completely unaware of the tension inside the cafe. Mark rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cup. You didn't mention that before. I didn't know how long I'd stay. Mark nodded slowly. That made sense. Still, the thought of John disappearing across the world again felt wrong. John studied him carefully. I figured you'd want space. Mark gave a small laugh. Guess you got that idea from me. Another silence settled between them. Mark looked up. John's expression was calm, but there was something tired behind it. Mark felt the words rising in his chest. The truth. That he missed the late-night texts. That the diner had meant more to him than he wanted to admit. that the scent of concrete and leather still lingered in his thoughts. He opened his mouth, then stopped. 45 years old. Construction worker. Omega, who had already complicated John's life once. Mark closed his mouth again. Instead he said quietly, "Your concerts will keep you busy." John watched him carefully. Yes. The word felt final. They finished their coffee slowly. Eventually John stood. "I should go." Mark nodded. "Yeah." John hesitated slightly before leaving. For a brief moment, it looked like he might say something else. But he didn't. He simply walked toward the door. Mark watched him go. Outside, John paused on the sidewalk. His chest felt strangely heavy. He had hoped Mark might stop him, or say something, but the cafe door stayed closed behind him. John slipped his hands into his coat pockets and walked away. And for the first time since they met, he believed Mark truly didn't want him. Chapter 13: The Silence Between Cities. The tour started the way it always did. Fast, demanding, relentless. 3 days after leaving Boston, John Lee stepped onto a concert stage in Chicago. The hall was packed, the lights bright, the piano waiting exactly where it always waited. Everything felt familiar, comfortably predictable. John adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The music came easily. Years of training made sure of that. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, building each phrase exactly the way the composer intended. The audience leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every note. When the final chord echoed through the hall, the crowd erupted into applause. They stood, they cheered, they called his name. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, John bowed once, straightened his jacket, and walked off stage feeling strangely empty. Weeks passed. Chicago became New York. New York became London. London became Vienna again. Airports blurred together. Hotel rooms blurred together. Concert halls filled and emptied in the same endless cycle. Every performance went perfectly. Critics wrote glowing reviews. John Lee delivers another breathtaking performance. A pianist at the height of his mastery. John read none of them. At night, after rehearsals or performances, he often found himself staring at his phone. The same contact remained near the top of his message list. Mark, brick guy. They hadn't spoken in weeks. John told himself that was fine. Mark had been clear. Still think it's better if we slow things down. John had respected that. Still, sometimes he opened the conversation just to read the old messages. The photo of the brick wall. The jokes about diner food. The quiet conversation about faded pears. Then he would lock the phone again and go back to practicing. Back in Boston, Mark Samuel returned fully to work. Construction had never stopped. It never did. Buildings needed finishing. Walls needed raising. Bricks needed placing exactly where they belonged. The routine helped. Wake up early. Work until late afternoon. Drink a beer with Carlos and Luis. Sleep. Repeat. At first, the silence from John had felt expected. After all, Mark had been the one to create distance. But as the weeks passed, something else settled in. An absence. His phone stayed quiet in the evenings. No sarcastic messages about construction work. No questions about coffee or music. Mark told himself that was normal. John was a world-famous pianist traveling the globe. He didn't have time to text a bricklayer every night. Still, sometimes Mark caught himself glancing at his phone during dinner, just in case. One evening, Luis noticed. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. Mark shook his head. "Just checking the time." Luis didn't look convinced. 2 months later, John sat alone in a quiet hotel room in Vienna. The city lights stretched beyond the tall windows, glowing softly against the dark sky. The concert that evening had gone flawlessly. Another standing ovation. Another perfect review waiting somewhere online. John sat on the edge of the bed, phone in his hand. His thumb hovered over the familiar contact. He had opened the conversation 3 times already tonight, then closed it again. Finally he exhaled and typed, "Do apples always smell like that?" He stared at the message for a second, then pressed send. Across the ocean, Mark's phone buzzed on the nightstand beside his bed. He woke slightly, squinting at the screen. The name made him sit up immediately. John Piano. Mark opened the message. Do apples always smell like that? He stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed quietly to himself and started typing. Chapter 14, The Confession. Mark stared at the message for a long time. The room around him was dark except for the glow of his phone screen. Do apples always smell like that? He rubbed a hand down his face and let out a quiet laugh. Only John would reopen 2 months of silence with something like that. Mark leaned back against the headboard and started typing. Depends. He paused, then added, Do pianists always smell like concrete and leather? He hit send before he could overthink it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the typing bubble appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Finally, John responded. Apparently. Mark smiled faintly. Just like that, the silence between them cracked open. Vienna was quiet outside John's hotel window. He hadn't expected Mark to reply so quickly, or at all. When the answer appeared, John felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. Depends. He read the second message and let out a quiet breath. Do pianists always smell like concrete and leather? John typed slowly. Only around bricklayers. 3 dots appeared immediately. Good to know. The conversation continued. At first it stayed light. Mark asked how many cities John had visited so far. John complained about airport food. Mark sent a photo of a half-finished brick wall glowing under construction lights. John stared at the image longer than necessary. Felt strangely familiar. Comforting. They talked for nearly an hour before the conversation shifted. John leaned back against the hotel pillows and typed. I thought you didn't want to hear from me anymore. The typing bubble on Mark's end stopped for a long moment, then started again. Across Boston, Mark sat in his kitchen staring at the message. That wasn't what he expected. He typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, he sent the truth. I thought the same thing. John blinked at the screen. You told me we should slow things down. Another pause. Then Mark replied. Yeah. Another message followed. Because I was being an idiot. John frowned slightly. Explain. Mark sighed and ran a hand through his hair. How did you explain insecurity to someone like John Lee? He started typing anyway. You're 30. You're famous. You travel the world playing piano in places I've only seen on TV. Another message appeared. I build walls for a living. John read the words carefully. Mark continued. And I'm 45. You ever try explaining that situation to the internet? John sat up straighter. I don't care about the internet. Maybe you don't, Mark replied. But I do. A long pause followed. Then John typed slowly. You're the only person who ever made me nervous. Mark blinked. He reread the message twice. What? John stared at the screen. Then continued. I've played in front of presidents. Thousands of people. Entire orchestras waiting for me to start. Another message appeared. None of that made me nervous. Then, walking into that diner did. Mark let out a surprised laugh. Why? John answered immediately. Because you looked at me like I was just a guy. Mark leaned back in his chair. His chest felt strangely tight again. Not uncomfortable. Just full. They kept talking. Longer this time. About the silence between them. About the argument. About the strange pull neither of them had managed to shake. Eventually John typed something new. I'll be back in Boston in 2 weeks. Mark's heartbeat picked up slightly. Yeah. Short break between tours. A pause. Then John added, if you're not avoiding me. Mark stared at the message. He thought about the construction site, the cafe, the diner. The first moment their eyes met across dust and scaffolding. Finally he typed, construction site. John's response came instantly. The first one? Yeah. Another pause. Late night? John asked. Mark smiled faintly. Late night. The conversation slowed after that. But neither of them ended it right away. For the first time in months, the silence between cities didn't feel so heavy. Chapter 15 The Choice. Boston looked different at night. The streets near the construction site were quiet, lit mostly by scattered street lamps and the pale glow of a few work lights left running for security. The half-built building stood exactly where it had been months ago, except now the brick walls were higher, stronger, closer to finished. Mark Samuel stood beside the same section of wall where he'd been working the day John Lee's car broke down. His hands rested in the pockets of his jacket as he watched the empty street. It had been 2 weeks since their late-night conversation. 2 weeks since they agreed to meet here. Mark wasn't nervous. Not exactly. But something in his chest felt tight, like the moment before a fight, or before saying something that could change everything. Headlights turned the corner at the end of the street. Mark straightened slightly. The black sedan pulled slowly to the curb. For a second, neither man moved. Then John stepped out of the car. He looked almost exactly the same as the last time Mark saw him. Dark coat, serious expression, posture calm but alert. Except his eyes softened immediately when he spotted Mark. "Hey," John said. Mark nodded. "Hey." They stood a few feet apart for a moment. The quiet between them felt strange after weeks of late-night conversations through a phone screen. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "So, Vienna again." John exhaled quietly. "Among other places." Mark nodded. "Busy. Always." Another pause settled between them. The scent of apples drifted faintly through the cool night air. John noticed it immediately. Mark noticed John noticing. He chuckled softly. "Still smells the same?" John allowed a faint smile. "Yeah." The tension eased just slightly. They walked slowly along the edge of the construction site, boots crunching softly against loose gravel. Mark glanced at the rising brick walls. "You missed a lot of progress." "I noticed." John reached out briefly, running his fingers along the surface of the bricks. "Solid, carefully aligned." "Still building things that stay?" he asked. Mark shrugged. "Someone's gotta do it." They stopped walking near the scaffold. John leaned against a stack of lumber. "I got an offer." Mark looked at him. "What kind?" "A tour." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're always touring." John shook his head slightly. "This one's different." He hesitated. "Multi-year." The words hung in the cold air. Mark studied him quietly. "That's big." "Yeah." John's voice was calm, but his gaze stayed fixed on Mark. "Which means I'd be gone a lot." Mark rubbed his beard slowly. "You're already gone a lot." John didn't smile. "This would be more." The silence stretched. Finally John spoke again. "I need to decide soon." Mark nodded. "Sounds like an easy choice." John shook his head. "Not really." Mark frowned slightly. "Why not?" John met his eyes directly. "Because of you." Mark blinked. John continued. "I've spent most of my life moving from city to city." He gestured vaguely around them. "Then I meet a bricklayer in Boston who makes me want to stay." Mark let out a quiet breath. "That's a dangerous habit." "Maybe." John pushed himself away from the lumber stack. He stepped closer. "Is long distance even worth trying?" The question hung between them. Mark looked at the unfinished building around them, at the bricks stacked neatly along the wall, at the place where everything started. Then he looked back at John. "You remember what I said about fated pairs?" Mark asked. John nodded slowly. "You said it was probably too late." Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah." He gestured toward the construction site. "But if fate bothered to send a world-famous pianist's car breaking down right here," his voice softened, "I'm not ignoring it." For a moment John didn't move. Then he stepped forward, close enough that Mark could feel the steady scent of concrete and leather again. "You're sure?" John asked quietly. Mark met his gaze. "Yeah." John leaned in. The kiss was slow, careful, but unmistakable. When they pulled apart, Mark laughed softly. "Took you long enough." John's serious expression cracked into a rare smile. "Bricklayers are stubborn." Mark shrugged. "Pianists aren't much better." Above them, the unfinished building stood quietly in the night, still rising. still becoming something new. Epilogue, where it started. 2 years later, the building stood finished. Clean glass windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, and the brick walls wrapped around the structure with quiet strength. People moved in and out of the entrance carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and backpacks, never giving the building itself a second thought. To them, it was just another part of Boston. But to Mark Samuel, it was something else entirely. He stood across the street with his hands resting on his hips, studying the building the way a carpenter might admire a finished piece of furniture. Beside him, John Lee adjusted the sleeves of his coat and followed Mark's gaze. "So," John said, tilting his head slightly, "you built this one." "Part of it," Mark corrected. John glanced at him. "That's modest." Mark snorted softly. Construction's always a team job. 2 years had changed things. Mark still worked construction, but now he owned the small contracting company instead of just laying bricks for someone else. Carlos and Luis both worked for him full-time now, along with a handful of younger guys who were still learning the trade. Running a business had come with long hours and plenty of stress. But Mark liked it. He liked building things that lasted. John's life, meanwhile, still moved at a different rhythm. Concert halls, airports, cities across the world. The difference now was that Boston had quietly become home base again. Between tours, John returned here more and more often. Mark pretended not to notice how carefully those breaks lined up with his schedule. They crossed the street together, stopping beside the building's brick exterior. Mark stepped closer to the wall. "This section," he said, tapping a specific row of bricks lightly with his knuckle. John raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Mark smiled faintly. "This was the wall I was working on when your car broke down." John leaned forward slightly, studying the bricks. They looked like any other part of the building, perfectly aligned, solid, quietly sturdy. But knowing that detail made the moment feel strangely significant. John reached out and ran his fingers along the surface. "You built it straight," he said. Mark laughed. "That's the goal." John glanced at him. "I mean unusually straight." Mark narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What's that supposed to mean?" John shrugged casually. "I'm just saying, maybe you were trying to impress someone." Mark barked out a laugh. "Oh yeah." John nodded thoughtfully. Tall, handsome pianist watching from the street. Mark shook his head. "You weren't handsome that day." John blinked. Nope. Mark crossed his arms. "You looked like a guy whose expensive car just died." John let out a quiet laugh. "Fair." For a moment they simply stood there. The street buzzed quietly around them. People passing by. Cars rolling through the intersection. Ordinary life continuing. John leaned his shoulder lightly against Mark's arm. The contact was casual. Natural. "Funny thing about fate," Mark said after a moment. John glanced at him. "Oh." Mark nodded toward the street behind them. "If your car hadn't broken down right there." He trailed off. John finished the thought softly. "We probably never would have met." Mark hummed in agreement. John studied the wall one more time before turning back toward him. "You know," he said thoughtfully. "What?" John smiled faintly. "You're the only person I know who can make a brick wall feel romantic." Mark rolled his eyes. "That's the dumbest thing you've ever said." "Probably." Mark reached out and pulled him a little closer anyway. The scent of apples mixed quietly with concrete and leather in the cool Boston air. And for once, John Lee smiled without a piano anywhere nearby.